My name is Claire Bennett, and I spent the last 3 years of my grandmother's life in the guest room of her Craftsman house in Seattle's Wallingford neighborhood, and I spent the 14 months after her death defending myself in King County Superior Court against my own mother and 3 siblings who believed, or at least argued convincingly that they believed, that I had manipulated an 86-year-old woman into signing away $6.3 million. I've had a long time to think about how to tell this story since it ended, and I've come to believe there isn't a version of it that makes everyone look good, including me. I made choices during those 3 years, out of love and exhaustion, and if I'm honest, some amount of self-interest too, that I'd make differently if I could do it all again. Even though nothing about those choices was ever the manipulation my family's lawyer described to a room full of strangers. I want to start with my grandmother, Eleanor Voss, because none of what happened afterward makes any sense without understanding who she actually was, as opposed to the fragile, confused figure my family's attorney described to a courtroom that never met her. My grandmother built her fortune herself, which is not a small detail in this story. It's the entire foundation of it. She started as a bookkeeper for a small Seattle shipping company in 1961. At 22, one of the only women in that office, and over the following 4 decades worked her way into increasingly senior financial roles, eventually becoming the company's CFO in an era when that title, for a woman, required a specific kind of relentlessness most people never had to develop. She used to tell me about the specific humiliations of those early decades, being asked, in her 30s, already a senior manager, to fetch coffee for a meeting she was chairing, being paid, for years, demonstrably less than men in comparable roles until she finally, at 40, walked into the company president's office with her own competitor's salary research and simply refused to leave until he corrected it. She invested her own money carefully and aggressively throughout those decades, mostly in real estate around Seattle before the city's tech boom made that real estate worth an almost unrecognizable multiple of what she'd paid, and by the time she retired at 68, she had built a personal fortune entirely separate from any husband's money. My grandfather, a quiet, kind man who died when I was 11, had been a high school shop teacher, and everyone in the family understood, without it ever needing to be said aloud, that whatever wealth existed in that family existed because of Eleanor, not because of him. She was, by every account from people who actually knew her in her final years, sharper at 85 than most people are at 50. She did the crossword in ink. She managed her own investment portfolio, with light guidance from a financial advisor she'd worked with for over 20 years, right up until about 8 months before she died. She read 3 newspapers a day, digital and print both, and had opinions about all of them that she was never shy about sharing at family dinners, opinions that grew over the years, increasingly sharp-edged towards certain members of our family in ways I understood far better than my siblings ever wanted to admit. She kept a leather-bound ledger, a genuine physical ledger, alongside her digital accounts, a habit from her bookkeeping days she never fully abandoned, recording not just her finances, but small daily observations in the margins, a habit that would end up mattering more to this story than I could have anticipated at the time. Here is the family structure that matters to this story. I'm the second of 4 children. My older brother, Preston, is a commercial real estate broker in Bellevue, financially comfortable but perpetually convinced he's owed more than he has, a belief I think traces back to a childhood where he was positioned, implicitly, as the eldest and therefore most deserving, a positioning that never quite panned out the way he expected once Eleanor's actual estate planning became relevant. I remember him telling me once, years before any of this started, half joking but not entirely, that he'd always assumed he'd eventually run whatever Eleanor left behind, the same reflexive assumption of primacy that seems to attach itself to firstborn sons in families like ours regardless of whether anyone ever actually promises them that role. My younger sister, Marisol, is a marketing director in Portland, sharp and articulate, the sibling who ended up leading the lawsuit, and I think, watching her over the years, that her particular hunger for control, over her career, over her own image, eventually over Eleanor's finances, came from a genuine, understandable place. She'd watched our mother spend decades feeling powerless relative to her own mother's success, and Marisol had decided, I think somewhere in her 20s, that she would never let herself end up in that same position, that she would get ahead of any uncertainty about her own financial future by whatever means available, a defensive instinct that eventually curdled, under enough pressure, into something closer to entitlement than protection. My youngest brother, Desmond, an underemployed musician in his 30s who has, I think, spent most of his adult life hoping some external windfall would solve problems that were never really about money in the first place, joined the lawsuit last, reluctantly mostly, I believe now, out of a fear of being the only sibling not aligned with the rest of the family rather than any real personal conviction that I'd done something wrong. My mother, Diane, is Eleanor's only child, and I think it's fair to say, as gently as I can manage it, that my mother spent most of her adult life in a complicated orbit around her own mother's success, proud of it publicly, resentful of it privately, in the specific way that sometimes happens between a formidable parent and a child who never quite found their own separate ground to stand on. My mother married my father, a mid-level insurance adjuster, had 4 children, and lived a comfortable but distinctly more modest life than the one she'd grown up in, a gap I think she felt more acutely with each passing year, especially as Eleanor's Seattle real estate holdings kept appreciating while my parents' own retirement accounts grew far more slowly. I think, more than any of my siblings, my mother's participation in the lawsuit was never really about the money at all. It was about a lifetime of wondering whether her own mother had truly loved her as fully as she seemed to love other people, a question the will's uneven distribution answered, in my mother's reading of it, in the most painful possible way, regardless of what Eleanor had actually intended by it. I became close with my grandmother almost by accident. I studied landscape architecture at the University of Washington, and during my last 2 years of school, I started helping Eleanor with the extensive gardens surrounding her Wallingford property, initially just as a way to earn some extra money, and over those 2 years, something genuine grew between us that had very little to do with gardening and everything to do with 2 people who, it turned out, communicated in similar ways, direct, unsentimental, allergic to small talk, both more comfortable discussing a specific problem than an abstract feeling. I built a career after graduation designing residential and small commercial landscapes across the Seattle area, work I'm genuinely proud of, work that has nothing to do with my grandmother's money and everything to do with 15 years of building relationships with contractors and clients one project at a time. When Eleanor's health began declining seriously about 3.5 years before she died, a combination of worsening arthritis and a cardiac condition that made living alone increasingly risky, I was the one who offered to move into her guest room, not because anyone assigned me that role, but because I was the only one of her 4 grandchildren who lived close enough, and unmarried enough, and flexible enough in my own work schedule to actually do it without appending an entire family of my own. My mother offered, too, in the early conversations, but Eleanor, with a directness I both admired and occasionally found painful to be on the other end of, told her she'd rather have someone who won't spend the whole time reminding me what it cost her to be here, a comment that landed exactly as sharply as she meant it to, and one my mother has never fully forgiven either of us for. I want to be honest about what those 3 years actually looked like because it matters enormously to what came later. It was not most days some tender cinematic caregiving montage. It was managing 11 different prescriptions and their interactions. It was driving her to appointments and sitting through hours of waiting rooms. It was the specific exhaustion of being on call, emotionally and physically, for a woman who was still sharp enough to know exactly how much she needed help and resented every bit of that need with real ferocity. I remember one particularly hard stretch, about 1.5 years in, when her arthritis flared badly enough that she couldn't manage stairs for nearly 6 weeks, and I moved a bed into her downstairs study, and spent those 6 weeks essentially living 2 lives simultaneously, running my landscape design business by day, often from her kitchen table, laptop open next to her crossword, and managing her care by night, learning to recognize the specific tone of voice that meant she was in real pain versus simply irritable, a distinction that took me months to reliably read correctly. It was also, genuinely, some of the richest time of my adult life. Long evenings on her porch where she told me stories about the shipping company in the 60s, about my grandfather, about decisions she'd made in her career that she was proud of, and a few she wasn't. The kind of unguarded history a person only shares with someone they've decided, deliberately, to trust with it. She told me, One of those evenings about a job offer she'd turned down in her 50s, a much larger role at a competing firm that would have meant relocating to San Francisco, and how she'd stayed in Seattle instead, partly for my grandfather's sake. Partly, she admitted, because she'd never quite trusted that the new firm's offer wasn't at least partly a novelty hire, a decision she said she still turned over sometimes, decades later, wondering about the life she hadn't lived. Those conversations are the actual inheritance I value most, more than the house, more than the portfolio, though I understand how strange that probably sounds to anyone who's watched this story unfold only through the lens of a $6.3 million number. My siblings visited during those 3 years. I want to be fair about that, because the version of this story where they simply abandoned her isn't accurate either. Preston came by every few months, usually for an hour, usually with some real estate opportunity he wanted her advice or investment in. Marisol called more often than she visited, monthly calls that Eleanor described to me, more than once, as checking in on her own future, a characterization I think was unfair in some of those calls and painfully accurate in others. Desmond visited the least, though when he did come, Eleanor genuinely lit up in a way she didn't for the others, something about his particular chaotic, artistic energy that reminded her, she told me once, of her own younger sister, who died decades earlier. My mother visited regularly but briefly, visits that I think were genuinely hard for her, freighted with a lifetime of complicated feelings she never fully worked through with her own mother while there was still time. Eleanor updated her 11 months before she died, at her financial advisor's office, with her longtime estate attorney present, and with a notary public named Yolanda Reyes, who I'd never met before that day, brought in specifically to witness and notarize the execution. I was present in the building, in a waiting area, because I'd driven Eleanor to the appointment, but I was not in the room during the actual signing, a detail that would become the entire crux of the lawsuit, twisted, in my family's attorney's framing, into the defendant was present, alone, when it was executed. A claim that was technically true about my presence in the building and categorically false about my presence during the signing itself. The will left the bulk of her estate, the Wallingford property, now worth close to $4 million alone given Seattle's market, along with the majority of her investment portfolio, totaling $6.3 million combined. To me, with smaller specific bequests to each of my 3 siblings, $25,000 apiece, and a further $100,000 to my mother. It was not an equal division, not close to one, and I understood, reading it for the first time alongside my family at the attorney's office after Eleanor's death, exactly how it would look to people who hadn't spent 3 years watching what actually happened in that house. My mother's face, in that reading, is something I will never forget. Not shock exactly, more a kind of vindicated devastation, as though some fear she'd carried her whole life about her own mother's true feelings toward her had finally, formally, been confirmed in writing. Preston's face went through several calculations I could almost watch happening in real time. Marisol left the room within minutes, and by the following week, she had retained an attorney. The lawsuit alleged undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity, a combination claim arguing both that Eleanor hadn't been mentally competent to understand what she was signing and that I had actively manipulated her into it, 2 arguments that Odalise, no, my own attorney, a careful trusts and estates litigator named Harriet Okonkwo Baxter, pointed out to me early on, sit in some tension with each other, since a person too impaired to understand a document is a different legal claim than a person coerced into signing one she understood perfectly well. They're hedging, Harriet told me, in our first meeting, which usually means they don't actually have confidence in either claim individually. It means we need to be ready to dismantle both. The hearing was in the King County Superior Court downtown, a courtroom with tall windows that let in more actual daylight than most courtrooms I'd since learned to expect, afternoon sun slanting across the gallery in a way that felt, that day, almost cruelly indifferent to what was happening underneath it. My 3 siblings sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a sharp, aggressive litigator named Foss who specialized, according to Harriet, in exactly this kind of family estate dispute. My mother sat in the gallery, not at the plaintiff's table itself, a choice I understood, watching her, as her own complicated way of participating in the lawsuit without fully committing her name to it as a formal party. I noticed she'd worn a dress I recognized from Eleanor's own memorial service 7 months earlier, and I found myself unable to stop staring at it during the opening statements, the strange, quiet cruelty of watching mourning clothes repurposed for litigation. Grandma was not of sound mind when she signed this will, Foss argued, pacing with practiced confidence. And the defendant was present, alone, when it was executed. He built out the argument methodically, citing Eleanor's age, her medications, a handful of instances of forgetfulness Marisol and Preston had apparently compiled from years of phone calls and visits, framing normal age-related lapses as evidence of broader incapacity. A missed appointment here, a repeated story there, the ordinary texture of an 86-year-old's memory stretched, in Foss's telling, into something far more sinister than it had ever actually been in my daily experience of her. He spent nearly 20 minutes on Eleanor's medication regimen alone, walking through each prescription with the practiced gravity of a man who'd clearly consulted a medical expert willing to testify to potential cognitive side effects, building toward a closing line I remember precisely because of how flatly, confidently cruel it was. This woman manipulated an elderly woman out of $6.3 million. I sat next to Harriet through all of it, hands folded, doing the specific work of not reacting that she'd coached me through in our prep sessions, though I remember, internally, cataloging every factual distortion as it happened. The missed appointment Foss cited had been a scheduling conflict I'd personally resolved within the hour. The repeated story had been Eleanor telling the same anecdote about the shipping company twice in one visit, something she did deliberately for emphasis. A stylistic habit rather than a cognitive lapse, something anyone who'd actually spent real time with her would have recognized instantly. The judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Castellanos, turned to me. I said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." The back door of the courtroom opened, and Yolanda Reyes walked in, a woman I'd met exactly twice in my life, once at the signing itself, briefly, in the waiting area, and once several months earlier, when Harriet's office had taken her deposition. I watched my sister see her, watched something cross Marisol's face that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite panic, some third thing in between, and I watched her stand up from her chair, halfway, before catching herself and sitting back down, a small, involuntary motion that the entire courtroom noticed, including Judge Castellanos, whose eyes moved, sharp and immediate, from the witness to my sister and back again. I didn't understand, in that moment, why Marisol's reaction had been so specific, so immediate, so clearly more than simple surprise at an unexpected witness. I found out during Yolanda's testimony, and it changed the entire emotional register of that courtroom for the rest of the afternoon. Yolanda testified, first, to the straightforward facts Harriet needed on the record, that she had personally witnessed Eleanor Voss review and sign the will, that she had engaged Eleanor directly in conversation before the signing specifically to assess her orientation and comprehension, standard notary practice for a document of that significance, and that Eleanor had been, in her professional assessment, entirely lucid, sharp, and specific about her intentions, at one point correcting a minor clerical detail in the document herself before signing. Yolanda described, in some detail, a brief exchange in which she'd asked Eleanor, as a matter of routine practice, to explain in her own words what the document did and who would receive what, and Eleanor had answered precisely, naming each beneficiary and amount from memory, adding, unprompted, according to Yolanda's notes, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know it won't make everyone happy, and that's all right with me." She testified that I had not been present in the room at any point during the signing, confirming what Harriet already knew from the attorney's own office logs. Then Foss, on cross-examination, asked Yolanda a routine background question, how she had come to be selected as the notary for that particular appointment, and Yolanda answered, without any apparent awareness that her answer was about to detonate something, that she had actually met Eleanor once before, several months prior to the will signing, in a different notarial context, notarizing a durable power of attorney document that Eleanor had, at that earlier appointment, declined to sign. After a private conversation with Yolanda in which Eleanor had expressed discomfort with the document's terms and with what Eleanor had described, according to Yolanda's notes from that day, as pressure from one of my grandchildren, to sign it quickly. Marisol had been the one who'd arranged that earlier appointment. I hadn't known it had ever happened until that exact moment, sitting in that courtroom. Neither had Harriet. It had been, apparently, an attempt 8 months before the actual will was executed to get Eleanor to sign a power of attorney that would have given Marisol significant control over Eleanor's finances while she was still alive, an attempt Eleanor had quietly declined and, as far as I could tell, never mentioned to anyone in the family, including me. I watched Voss's face change as he realized, mid-question, that he had just opened a door he had no way to close. I watched Judge Castellanos' expression sharpen into the specific, focused attention of someone recalculating an entire case in real time, and I watched her ask Yolanda, directly, whether her notes from that earlier appointment were still available, a question Yolanda answered by producing, from a folder she'd brought with her, a copy of the original notarial journal entry, dated and signed. Exactly the kind of unglamorous, contemporaneous record that carries enormous weight in a courtroom. Precisely because nobody thinks to fabricate a routine bureaucratic log months before they'd have any reason to need it. And I watched my sister, at the plaintiff's table, go very pale, very still, the posture of someone realizing that the exact narrative she'd built her entire lawsuit around, a granddaughter isolating and manipulating a vulnerable elderly woman, had just been quietly, devastatingly inverted, in front of a judge, by a witness she hadn't anticipated and couldn't discredit. The case did not proceed to a jury. Judge Castellanos, after a brief recess, invited both attorneys to a conference in chambers, and by the end of that week, Marisol's attorney filed a formal withdrawal of the complaint. I don't know everything that was said in that conference, but Harriet told me afterward that Judge Castellanos had been, in her words, unusually direct about the credibility problems the new testimony had created for the plaintiffs, direct enough that continuing to trial would have exposed my siblings to real risk of a much worse outcome than simply losing. The possibility of the court referring the earlier power of attorney incident for further scrutiny of its own. I kept the inheritance. I want to say that plainly because it's true, and because it would be easy to tell the story as though the money became irrelevant once the case resolved, and it didn't. I sold my landscape design business partial ownership stake and used a portion of the inheritance to open a second location, expanding into a design-build practice I'd wanted to attempt for years, but never had the capital for, and I've kept Eleanor's Wallingford house, living in it myself now, tending the gardens we used to work on together, which feels less like inheriting a property and more like continuing a conversation that technically ended but doesn't, in my daily experience of that house, feel finished. That's not the same as saying I came out of this hole. My mother has not spoken to me in the 8 months since the case ended, not one call, not one holiday acknowledgement, and I understand, more than I wish I did, that some part of her genuinely believes, still, that I took something from her that was rightfully hers. A belief that predates the will entirely and traces back to a lifetime of feeling like her own mother's love had always been somehow more available to other people than to her. I sent her a card on her birthday 4 months ago, unsigned by any expectation of a response, just a short note saying I was thinking of her, and I never heard back, and I've decided I'm going to keep sending small, low-pressure gestures like that indefinitely, not because I expect them to work, but because I don't want the door to be one I closed, even if she's the one who's chosen, for now, to keep it shut. Preston has been cordial but distant, the careful politeness of someone protecting a future relationship he hasn't decided whether he wants yet. He texted me a brief, businesslike message after the case ended, something about hoping we could put this behind us eventually, a sentiment I appreciated even as I noticed how carefully it avoided anything resembling an actual apology. Desmond, unexpectedly, has become closer to me since the case ended than he ever was before it, calling more often, visiting the Wallingford house twice now just to sit in the garden, and I think some part of him has separated, more successfully than the rest of the family, the money from the actual grief of losing Eleanor, which he seems to be finally allowing himself to feel now that the legal noise around it has quieted. He brought his guitar the second visit and played something in the garden he said he'd written for her, unfinished, a little rough, and I sat there and cried in a way I hadn't let myself do since before the lawsuit started, grateful for one sibling relationship that had somehow come out of all of this more honest than it went in. Marisol, and I have not spoken since the hearing. I don't know what she believes now, whether the power of attorney revelation changed her own private understanding of what she'd attempted, or whether she's built some version of events where that, too, gets reframed into something more forgivable. I think about her more than I expected to, given how the case ended. Not with anger, mostly, but with a kind of grief for the sister I remember from childhood, before either of us understood what our grandmother's success would eventually cost our family's ability to simply love each other without a ledger attached. The rest of my life kept moving through all of it, the 14 months of litigation folded into an otherwise ordinary stretch of years. My business partner, a meticulous contractor named Deshawn Becky, who I've worked alongside for 9 years, ran point on 2 major projects almost entirely solo during the worst stretch of the case, never once making me feel guilty about my divided attention, the kind of professional loyalty I don't think I've properly thanked him for yet. Deshawn lost his own mother the year before Eleanor died, and I think that shared, recent experience of grief gave him a specific patience with my distraction that a business partner without that context might not have extended so readily. He never once asked me to explain myself when I had to reschedule a site visit or take a call from Harriet in the middle of a client meeting, just quietly absorbed whatever needed absorbing, and let me handle the rest when I was able to. My closest friend, Ingrid, a former classmate from my landscape architecture program who now runs her own firm in Tacoma, drove up for the hearing without me asking her to, sat in the gallery the entire day, and took me to dinner afterward where we talked about anything except the case, precisely because she understood I needed exactly that. Ingrid and I have known each other for 15 years now, since our first studio class in undergrad, and there's a specific comfort in a friendship that predates every major decision of your adult life. She remembers me before Eleanor got sick, before the business, before any of this, and something about her presence in that courtroom gallery reminded me, in the middle of the worst afternoon of the entire case, that I was still the same person I'd been before any of it started, whatever the verdict ended up being. I started about 6 months ago, volunteering one Saturday a month with a nonprofit that maintains public gardens across Seattle's park system, work that has nothing to do with billable hours or inheritance disputes, just dirt and plants and the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of watching something grow because you tended it correctly. I got involved almost by accident, through a client who mentioned the organization needed volunteers with actual horticultural expertise, and I found, over these past months, a kind of quiet repair happening in that work that I didn't fully anticipate, something about kneeling in public soil, working alongside strangers who have no idea what my last name is connected to, that has done more for whatever version of peace I've managed to find than almost anything else this year. I've also started dating again, cautiously, after a 2-year gap that predates the lawsuit entirely, but that the litigation certainly didn't help shorten. I met someone, a marine biologist named Owen, who works out of the University of Washington's oceanography department, through a mutual friend about 4 months ago, and I've been careful, deliberately careful, about how much of the Eleanor situation I've shared with him so far, not out of any dishonesty, but because I wanted at least one relationship in my life, this year, to start on ground that had nothing to do with money or litigation, or a family's fractured grief. He knows the broad outline now. He was there for the final weeks of the case, patient in the specific way new relationships sometimes surprise you by being, but I've been grateful, more than I expected, for how much of our time together has simply been ordinary, unremarkable, blessedly separate from any courtroom. I think about Eleanor almost every day, more since the case ended than during it, when I was too consumed with defending her decision to actually grieve the woman who made it. I think about her sitting across from Yolanda Reyes 8 months before her death, declining to sign a document she didn't trust, quietly protecting herself from a grandchild who wanted more control than she was willing to give, never telling any of us it had happened, carrying that small, private act of self-protection alone, the same relentless independence that built her entire fortune in the first place. I don't know if she ever imagined that same quiet refusal would end up, years later, saving the will she'd actually wanted honored. I like to think some part of her would have found it satisfying, in the same dry, unsentimental way she found most things satisfying, not as vindication exactly, just as evidence that she'd read the situation correctly the whole time, the way she read almost everything correctly, right up until the very end. I found her leather-bound ledger a few weeks after the case ended, going through a box of her things I hadn't yet been ready to open, and in the margin of an entry from the same month as that declined power of attorney appointment, in her small, precise handwriting, she'd written a single line I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. Came by again today. I know what she wants. I am not ready to give it to anyone, including Claire, though Claire, at least, has never once asked. I keep that ledger on my nightstand now. Not the portfolio statements, not the deed to the house, just that small leather book with her handwriting in it, because I think it's the truest document in this entire story, the one that was never meant for a courtroom, the one that simply recorded, day by day, a woman deciding for herself, right up until the end, exactly who had earned her trust and who hadn't.